Are Americans overfed yet malnourished? What is the state of health in America and the world today?
Unfortunately, over the last 3 decades, I was thinking with the new findings in nutritional science, people would get healthier and healthier. But unfortunately, it never happened. I think there's a growing number of people who are understanding these important concepts in nutritional science and utilizing those concepts to be healthier and living longer than ever before. But it's still a relatively minor part of our population. The majority of people are still too far influenced by the addictive nature of food and the unhealthy style of American diet that hooks them into eating that way psychologically, but physiologically and biologically as well, making it very hard for people to change and even think clearly or think logically. Because when you're an addict, being an addict takes over part of your brain's decision making. The primitive brain is now playing a role in protecting its attraction and love affair with these foods they think they can't live without. And people then can't make clear decisions about their health. So unfortunately, we have a growing waistline of the American population. And even though we had some dip in cancer rates and heart attack rates, when people started smoking less in the last 5 or 10 years, and then doctors stopped prescribing so much estrogen for women postmenopausally, which had an effect to reduce breast cancer rates, the combination of stopping smoking and the reduction of doctor prescribing had some beneficial effects, but then the overwhelming effect of people eating fast food and processed foods and getting heavier overwhelmed those positive aspects. And now we're seeing growth of cancer and heart attacks and obesity again. That's just doesn't seem to be easing up at this point.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? Keto diets are based on the proposition that for those predisposed to become obese and or diabetic, carbohydrate-rich foods trigger that predisposition. That isn't because of the calories they contain, as the conventional thinking on obesity assumes, but because of the effect these foods have on insulin, the hormone that dominates the regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism. Insulin is secreted mostly in response to carbohydrates, not just in the form of sugars, starches, and grains, whole or otherwise, but also fruits and legumes, which are the staples of a well-formulated plant-based diet. The hormonal insulin-centric regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism remains textbook medicine, yet its relevance to obesity has been effectively ignored by nutritionists and obesity researchers who have overwhelmingly preferred to think that all calories are equally capable of stimulating fat accumulation, that we get fat because we overeat, not because the carbohydrates we consume have some unique ability to stimulate fat accumulation. For some significant proportion of Americans, however, remaining relatively lean and healthy may require minimizing their insulin secretion. This, in turn, means more or less rigid abstinence from carbohydrate-rich foods. Animal source foods, meat, fish, fowl, and even processed meat, typically make up the bulk of this approach to weight control because they are almost entirely protein and fat with minimal carbohydrates. Until insulin was discovered in 1921 and insulin therapy was put to use in treating diabetes, these diets were known as animal diets. They were the standard of care for diabetes, delaying death in what today is called type 1 diabetes, the insulin-dependent form, and controlling the disease indefinitely in those with type 2, the common form associated with excess weight and age. This is still the case. So again, what are your thoughts on that passage from Gary Taubes?
Well, the overall thoughts is a lot of false information and misinformation that can lead to people's premature death. That's the main thought. But let me review a few of the points he made and make the counterpoint so people understand what we're talking about here. Number one, why do we give some studies more credence and other studies not as much credence? And it's okay to have a hypothesis. And a hypothesis can be based on some data from early studies, even controlled trials or short-term studies. We look and give people a diet, let's say high in meat, we carbohydrate restrict, we see their diabetic numbers look better, and then we hypothesize that if it makes their diabetic numbers look better in the short term, it must be right for them in the long term. Now we don't know that that's true. It may be the case that having good numbers in the short term is better for the long term. The same thing, you can give people a statin drug to lower their cholesterol. It does lower their cholesterol, and maybe lowering their cholesterol with a statin drug may extend lifespan from heart attack. But until we do some long-term studies with large numbers of people and look at and hard endpoints, not soft endpoint. A hard endpoint is something like death or a heart attack or cancer. Or cancer death. Those are called hard endpoints. A soft endpoint is your glucose looked better, your cholesterol went down. So it may be the case, but it's maybe the case that statin drugs increase risk of cancer so much that if we're looking at total deaths, that you may not have longer lifespan if we're looking at a study that goes on for 2 decades and has 5,000 people in it. A really significant study would be if we had 50,000 people in it and it went on for 20, 30 years and we looked at all-cause mortality and age of death. So in other words, for more definitive findings in the field of nutritional research, we're looking for some short-term studies with controlled trials, and we're seeing if they're corroborated with long-term studies that have those 3 criteria I'm talking about. The 3 criteria would be large numbers of participants, goes on for decades, not years. And number 3, we're looking at hard endpoints, not soft endpoints. And we have that corroboration between the short-term studies and the long-term studies, then we have something definitive to really affect people and they can benefit by. Too many people, and almost everybody in the nutrition field, picks the individual study they want to justify their viewpoint they want to protect. And they don't have the unbiased viewpoint of trying to collect most evidence possible. So with that as a preface, now I'll answer the question. All right, because insulin does play a role in disease, and especially excess insulin. Even with a type 1 diabetic, they need a certain amount of insulin. Like I had a type 1 diabetic come into my retreat last month, and he was using about 65 to 75 units of insulin a day. And I discussed with him that a person who's slim and healthy, eating right, only will require about 15 to 20 units of insulin a day, not 60. And if he follows the diet I recommend, a plant-based diet rich in beans and nuts and green vegetables and eggplants and mushrooms and onions, and that it would flood his body with antioxidants, with anti-cancer substances, slow the aging process. And because the foods are less glycemic than the carbohydrates he was choosing in the past, because obviously different foods have different glycemic loads, then he wouldn't require as much insulin. And I agree with Mr. Taubes in this respect that excess insulin is bad for you. Type 1 diabetic still requires some insulin. We don't want to have no insulin. We don't want to go into ketosis with no insulin, because ketosis creates an acid tied in the body that could have detrimental effects long term. But we want just enough insulin and no excess. So this type 1 diabetic, after he was only here for 1 month, after the first week or so, he was only requiring about 13 or 14 units of insulin a day. And by the time he left, 12 units of insulin a day was even too much from him. He was getting by on 11 units of insulin a day. And as he stopped having highs and lows, he could exercise, he could live right. He could, so in this case, eating so healthfully, I saved this person's life, because type 1 diabetics die prematurely because of their excess insulin, and because they're taught they can take any amount of insulin they want as long as they cover their glucose and keep their glucose well controlled, which is totally wrong, because excess insulin is a fat storage hormone that promotes angiogenesis, and is promotes cell proliferation and angiogenesis, which means angiogenesis is the growth of blood vessels to fuel the growth of tissue. The fat tissue and cancerous tissue can grow with excess promotion of angiogenesis. And insulin, of course, promotes cellular replication as well, so could be unfavorably promoting unhealthy tissue like cancerous tissue and allowing it to grow. So of course, he reduced his insulin amount he needs from like 70 to 11 or 12, but some insulin is obviously necessary. If we put him on a keto diet, this type 1, he could have used even less insulin perhaps, but don't forget that when you're eating the high saturated fats and all the fats in the keto diet, the saturated fats distorts the insulin receptor and make it not work as well. So now if he has a mango or some oatmeal or some fruit or a bean, he'll have a higher glycemic response to the carbohydrate because he's on a keto diet. The keto diet damages your cells and damages your cell receptors. So it makes you now respond more unfavorably to any glucose load that you now incur. Did you follow that? So the keto advocate like Taubes could say, well, I can't eat oatmeal or I can't eat a mango because my sugar, I took my finger stick and my sugar shot up to 200 after I ate a mango. Well, of course, if you're eating all that cheese and meat and all those fats, then you're going to have that reaction. But if you're eating a healthy diet, one with a lot of beans and nuts and greens, your receptors will come back to normal and you won't have such a high glycemic response to the mango, like this gentleman who was here and controlled his type 1 diabetes, now in much better shape. So let's review a few points here that Gary Taub made. Number one is that excess insulin is dangerous and that we score carbohydrates on a hierarchical scale of quality. And white flour is very much in the same ballpark as sugar, honey, and maple syrup, in that they spike a load of glucose entering the bloodstream at like 30 calories per minute. When you have calories that enter the bloodstream in such a large amount all at once, so fast, it's called a bolus in the medical terminology, then the body has to produce a huge insulin response to try to get that carbohydrate down. But when you eat a healthy meal that has, beans and spaghetti squash and green vegetables and a salad and some broccoli and, maybe an apple or an orange for dessert, obviously, there's about 5 different biochemical events that happen here. Number one, the carbohydrates in beans and spaghetti squash are slowly digestible carbohydrates that enter the bloodstream at 1 to 3 calories a minute, not 30 calories a minute. How much insulin does the body have to produce when your calories are entering slowly? When you digest beans or nuts, they're called slow foods. When you take oil or sugar or honey or white flour, that's called a fast food because the calories enter the bloodstream so rapidly. And when oil calories enter the bloodstream rapidly, you have damaging effects that occur as well compared to eating calories from nuts and seeds, whose fats break down slowly and enter the bloodstream over many hours. So beans as a whole, as a high carbohydrate food, have the most concentration and amount of slowly digestible carbohydrates, whose carbohydrate calories are released slowly over hours. That's why you're satiated the whole 3 or 4 hours afterwards, and you're feeling like you ate a lot of calories and you're not hungry the whole afternoon. Matter of fact, because beans also have the most fiber and resistant starch as well as the most slowly digestible carbohydrates. The resistant starch means all the starch calories marked on the bean don't even enter the bloodstream because they're resistant to enzymatic degradation. Now, this is very important because they fuel the growth of healthy bacteria now. The beans fuel the growth of healthy bacteria because they're a prebiotic or a substrate for the production of good bacteria. And they create a great microbiome that creates a thickened biofilm that covers the villi with gram-positive organisms, thus slowing the absorption of glucose from any food that you eat that's not a bean. So when you had that orange for dessert, the glycemic effect of the orange is now lessened because you have a thickened coating of a biofilm over your villi that slows the absorption of all carbohydrates, including non-bean carbohydrates. And scientists call that the second meal effect, which means should you have some oatmeal and a mango for breakfast or oatmeal and a banana for breakfast, the glycemic effect of that mango and the oatmeal is going to be lessened because you're a regular consumer of beans. And of course, there are other foods besides beans that favor a beneficial microbiome, like raw green vegetables and onions and cooked mushrooms. Let me deviate for a second, just to say that one more time for people so they get that there are 4 foods in particular that have the strongest effect on giving you a weight loss favorable microbiome and a microbiome that creates the most favorable biofilm that lowers the glycemic effect of all foods. And those are 2 raw foods. The 2 raw foods are raw green leafy vegetables, particularly raw cruciferous vegetables like raw kale or bok choy or cabbage or arugula. The second food is raw onion and scallion. Tremendous beneficial effects on the microbiome. And then the other 2 foods cooked are well-cooked beans. Beans should be well-cooked, and cooked mushrooms. 2 cooked foods, 2 raw foods have the most beneficial effect. But let's get back to this bean thing again, okay? Going back to the beans have this resistant starch. In the back, the bean may say 150 calories a cup, but keep in mind it's counting the resistant starch as calories. And when the body breaks down that carbohydrate it can't do it enzymatically. It has to do it by bacterial fermentation. So it ferments the resistant starch and turns it into short-chain fatty acids. So the starch in beans is converted into fat. It doesn't absorb it's not all absorbed as carbohydrate. And because the bacteria convert it so far down in the small intestines, towards the distal part of the small intestines, all those fats can't be absorbed into the bloodstream. 90% of them pass through into the large intestines and become part of our stool. 10% of the short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, gets absorbed in the distal part of the small intestines, and butyrate serves as an important messenger to the central nervous system to tell us to reduce our caloric intake. Butyrate is a fine tuner of the apostat regulator in the hypothalamus telling you to eat less. So what I've said in the last few minutes, I've said when the beans say 150 calories a cup, you feel like you ate 150 calories, your apostat is reduced by 150 calories, but all those calories never enter the bloodstream. Number two, those calories are so slowly absorbed that you hardly need any insulin to digest them. And number three, they encourage weight loss because they satiate you for the whole next 3 or 4 hours, and the calories are not even all coming in. So it leads to a negative caloric effect, negative between the amount of calories you desire versus the excess you have to control your metabolic rate. There's a lot of complicated factors I can get into in more detail here of how beans set your metabolic rate as well and how they lengthen lifespan. But now going back to what I said initially about 10 minutes ago about using long-term studies, because here's what we see when Gary Taubes' advice is evaluated in long-term studies. And I'm using these words carefully. I'm saying all the long-term studies, and there are many of them that look at high protein diets and keto diets long-term, show that even though short-term they appear to have some benefits on soft endpoints, when we study them long-term over time, whether it's the acidosis, the high amount of animal protein, the lack of whatever the reasons are, they lead to increased both cardiovascular mortality and cancer mortality. And many of these studies show that in the highest quintile of protein consumption, you have the most early life deaths. So what I'm saying right now is Gary Taubes' advice would be, if you try to follow that, most likely would occur the most dangerous of all possible diets you could possibly follow. Not something that's a little bit worse, but something probably that is the most dangerous way you could eat, as you're looking for an instant gratification by wanting to eat your meat and wanting to see your glucose controlled better. To review, your glucose is controlled even better or as well on a Nutritarian diet that I recommend, which is glycemically favorable. It's not a fruitarian diet. It's not a rice-based diet. It's not a potato-based diet. It's not a grain-based diet. It's vegetable-based with lots of greens and beans and nuts that are all glycemically favorable, but put together when you utilize the whole dietary portfolio, because nobody's eating one food. We're eating a huge variety of foods. And we utilize this huge variety of foods, both the phytonutrient exposure, the fiber exposure, and the beneficial effect on beneficial bacteria show tremendous benefits at lowering the glycemic load and the glycemic excursion, the speed at which the glucose into the bloodstream, and the need for insulin production. So we see that the diet style I'm recommending has the benefit of being low requirements of insulin, and the advantages of not having all the disadvantages of the high protein, high fat, high acid, high ketosis, and lack of phytochemical exposure. There's too many damaging effects. You're making a pact with the devil following a diet like that. And unfortunately, that appeals. People are following these keto and these carnivore diets. It appeals to their love affair with these rich foods, and they kind of like the macho feeling of shoving eating meat all day long and thinking you're going to be okay long term. But unfortunately, these people are in for a shock as they age rapidly and destroy their future health. So I could talk more about it, but I think that gives a good summary of it.